When historians recount the French Revolution of 1792, their attention typically lingers on the street-level chaos. The September massacres, the fall of the monarchy, the revolutionary fervor gripping Paris. But the true story, largely missing from revolutionary records and still buried in archival margins, unfolded inside the towers. It began with a simple confiscation order. Workers across France were instructed to remove bells from churches, cathedrals, and civic towers for metal reclamation to fuel the war effort. The goal was practical: the Republic needed to defend itself against monarchist forces. Confiscate the bronze, melt it down, and see if the material could supply the revolution's desperate need for cannons and currency. But the moment workers started pulling bells from Notre Dame and other ancient structures, something unexpected happened. They uncovered mechanisms that had stayed hidden for centuries. Inside the tower chambers, at heights few maintenance records ever mentioned, the teams found acoustic systems and resonance apparatus that didn't match any known bell hanging method. Their arrangement was strange. Their complexity was striking, and the engineering resembled nothing in contemporary bell founding manuals. It didn't even align with French or Italian campology, as normally understood. This never appeared in official revolutionary proclamations. It never reached the newspapers celebrating the Republic's victories. Yet in that year's internal documents, a specific phrase recurs: unexpected mechanisms, excessive complexity, purpose unclear. The official account would later reduce all of this to traditional bell supports, abandoned clock mechanisms, or merely decorative architectural features. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth attention. But the removal records from that period, processed in shadowy government buildings while Paris celebrated its liberation from the monarchy, reveal something else. They show workers standing next to copper conduits, fabricated with precision far beyond what any metalwork of that era should have produced. Components joined so seamlessly that even through the grainy quality of revolutionary-era sketches, their sophistication is undeniable. Patterns of coiled metal and geometric chambers that bear no resemblance to any documented European bell hanging tradition, but something older, more mathematical, more deliberate. And the further they dismantled, the less the system resembled campanology as we know it, and the more it looked like technology that had been used, maintained, and intentionally concealed. Initially, the removal crews tried to classify everything in the simplest possible terms: elaborate bell supports, forgotten tower machinery, decorative metalwork from earlier renovations. But as documentation grew and more systems were uncovered in towers across Paris, the contradictions multiplied. Why were certain acoustic chambers built with dimensions that created perfect harmonic resonance at specific frequencies? Why were particular copper coils arranged in geometric patterns, as if designed for energy distribution rather than sound production? Why did certain conduits continue deep into the tower walls, far beyond the limits of any bell installation? And the question that disturbed even the most conventional metalworkers: why were these systems so enormous? The bell removal required accurate inventories, yet the acoustic infrastructure inside sections of Notre Dame, Sainte-Chapelle, and dozens of parish churches seemed built for something vastly different than summoning the faithful to prayer. Removal crews admitted privately that the scale and sophistication didn't match any architectural or bell founding documentation. And while none of them used terms like vanish technologies, they were recognizing something equally unsettling. Someone had built these systems before. Not bells, not musical instruments. Power generation. As the records multiplied, so did the silence. Reports grew shorter. Accounts became vague. Sketches stopped showing the broadest views of the mechanisms. Then in late 1792, The tower chambers were partially resealed. The remaining infrastructure was secured where needed for structural stability, and much of what had been revealed was stripped of its components and melted down. Only fragments survived documentation, a few technical drawings, and the subdued accounts of archivists who examined the files before some vanished. But even from what remains, a pattern emerges: systems too sophisticated for any documented Bell installation, engineering too exact for the accepted chronology, construction techniques that appear inherited, infrastructure that seems to come from an entirely different technological era. When the removal crews first climbed past the initial accessible chambers within Paris's towers, the assumptions were simple. They expected to find standard bell hanging apparatus, maybe some abandoned clock machinery, and scattered traces of earlier renovations. Nothing strange, nothing exceptional. But within weeks, that assumption fell apart. Instead of a clear arrangement of bells and supports, the crews encountered a series of acoustic chambers that didn't function the way ordinary cathedral tower spaces are supposed to function. The first anomaly was tuning. Each tower, Notre Dame, St. Jacques Paix, Sainte Geneviève, and dozens more, seemed to share the same fundamental resonance frequency, the same harmonic intervals, the same geometric arrangement. Different churches, different builders, different centuries shouldn't produce that. Different architects, different bell founders, different hundreds of years. They don't build in perfect acoustic alignment with structures erected generations apart. Yet across Paris, they did. Resonance chambers from one cathedral positioned to amplify frequencies that matched perfectly with chambers in another church kilometers away. Acoustic channels aligned with channels in completely different districts. Bell chambers maintaining the same dimensional ratios, even when built in vastly different architectural styles. It was as if every tower that ever rose above Paris was replicating an original frequency pattern, one that no longer appears in any architectural documentation. As the workers climbed higher, the chambers grew stranger. Above the expected bell platforms and support beams, they began finding metalwork that looked nothing like bell, hanging apparatus, far more complex coils, much tighter geometric arrangements, configurations that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in Europe's recorded campology. Some chambers appeared almost excessive. Copper-lined spaces with perfect acoustic reflection, executed with an accuracy that didn't match the primitive metalworking of any documented period. Then came the discovery that confused even the most traditional members of the removal teams: crystalline deposits, mineral formations coating the metal surfaces, substances crystallized in patterns that only develop under sustained vibrational exposure at specific frequencies. Yet no historical documentation exists of these towers producing anything beyond standard bell tones. No records of continuous acoustic operation at the intensity needed to create such formations. Nothing that explains why large portions of the tower chambers looked as if they had been subjected to sustained harmonic resonance for centuries, possibly millennia. Removal sketches from 1792 show this unmistakably. Laborers beside coiled mechanisms so intricate that the men looked primitive by comparison. Copperwork fabricated so accurately that even contemporary electrical engineers examine the archival drawings in amazement. Geometric arrangements and acoustic chambers that mirror technological installations far more sophisticated than anything revolutionary France is credited with. But the most troubling detail wasn't what appeared in the documentation. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written after the confiscation barely reference these features. Some illustrations omit the most complex chambers entirely. Certain systems are dismissed with vague terms like decorative features or architectural embellishments, even though the sketches show they were far more intricate than that. The silence is hard to ignore. If these tower systems truly belonged to recognized Bell founding traditions, why weren't they depicted in detail? Why weren't the exceptional acoustic mechanisms thoroughly recorded? Why were the technical drawings scattered across revolutionary archives instead of compiled into a single metallurgical assessment? Even certain copper components posed a problem: geometric patterns too precise, surfaces too refined, crystalline deposits too consistent, formations that looked less like natural corrosion and more like the byproduct of sustained energy transmission. Transmission that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those towers were presumably built. What the removal crews uncovered were systems that didn't match French Bell founding, didn't match Italian campology, and didn't even match one another in traditional terms. Instead, they formed a peculiar technological vocabulary, one that appeared to come from multiple periods, yet somehow remained cohesive, harmonically aligned, and impossibly exact. The first surprise came from the chambers themselves. These weren't simple Bell platforms or basic acoustic spaces. They were geometrically flawless rooms, shaped with precise harmonic proportions. Copper-lined surfaces that preserved their reflective quality impeccably across centuries, and acoustic systems arranged with a coherence, almost like the remnants of a master frequency network that no longer exists in any repository. Some chambers were completely sealed, packed with material so dense that laborers assumed they had hit solid stone. But once breached, they revealed interiors that seemed undisturbed since the moment they were closed. Polished copper surfaces, geometric coil arrangements, and acoustic configurations that raised more questions than answers. Then came the feature that still baffles researchers today: the massive spherical metal housings. Officially, they were later labeled as Bell casings or decorative architectural features. But nothing about them matches standard Bell design or ornamental metalwork. They were too perfectly spherical, too precisely dimensioned, too flawlessly balanced, as if made with tools capable of sustaining perfect geometry. Some resonators were wide enough to hold a full-sized bell inside their hollow interiors. Others were solid metal with internal cavity structures, almost like housings for harmonic oscillators or frequency amplification devices. Workers from 1792 described them in personal correspondence as manufactured spheres, not bells, but geometric forms with an acoustic function, though no one could say what that function might have been. Another peculiarity appeared in the arrangement of certain copper systems. They didn't just support the bells from above. Many were configured in spiral patterns that made no architectural sense, descending through the tower walls, interconnected between chambers, or positioned around the spherical resonators in geometric arrays. This raised an unsettling possibility. The bells above might not merely have served to call the faithful. They might have been the visible components of something far larger. A system whose true scale was never documented, never taught, and never explained in the authorized history of European architecture. The deeper the workers went, the stranger the discoveries became. Copper components emerged with perfectly uniform dimensions. Some surfaces were polished to mirror finishes, refined, almost reflective. Others displayed precision, formed geometric patterns so exact that metallurgists today still debate what tools could have created them. But the most bewildering finding was the crystalline structures embedded within the copper itself. Certain formations appeared resonant, vibrational, frequency aligned, yet they sat in systems presumably older than any acoustic science sophisticated enough to produce such results. The official explanation later was natural mineral deposits, corrosion patterns. But that doesn't explain why the crystals form within the copper in patterns, not randomly distributed but aligned, geometric, organized as if the metal had been exposed to specific frequencies over long periods. That kind of result demands vibrational exposure far beyond bell ringing, far beyond any musical performance, and far beyond anything documented in European architectural history. Shortly after these findings, something strange began to happen. Chambers were stripped of their mechanisms. Systems were dismantled. Complex parts of the installations were removed from the towers entirely. Some of this was officially called metal reclamation, necessary to support the revolutionary war effort. But the choices about which systems to remove first and which components to melt down immediately raised quiet questions among witnesses. The mechanisms destroyed most quickly were invariably the ones that challenged the official timeline, the geometric resonators, the copper coil arrays, the crystal-coated systems, the acoustic chambers that seemed to connect to conduits extending throughout the tower structures. These conduits were possibly the most mysterious discovery of all. They weren't haphazard architectural features. They were components of a systematic configuration, a network of channels that looked less like construction details and more like infrastructure, aligned, calculated, organized as if they once linked to a much larger harmonic network, one that connected every major tower throughout Paris and perhaps beyond, long before any culture we recognize ever documented such systems. And yet, almost as quickly as they were revealed, many were destroyed. Their components melted down, their purpose unexplored, their presence quietly erased from later architectural surveys. When you examine the final months of the 1792 Bell confiscations, something becomes impossible to overlook. The operation didn't conclude naturally. It was accelerated. Not completed, not finished, accelerated. The further the removal crews proceeded, the more the character of their documentation changed. Early entries were procedural, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes guarded, vague, and oddly incomplete, as if someone else had suddenly taken control of what could be recorded. And this is where the ultimate mystery begins. Because the final chambers they accessed within Paris's highest towers weren't ordinary. They weren't architectural. They weren't decorative. They weren't even classifiable as bell, hanging apparatus. They were something else entirely. Multiple accounts, the few that survived, described systems that abruptly shifted from the recognizable to the inexplicable. Copperwork with connections so precise you couldn't slip a blade between them. Geometric chambers formed with accuracy that pre-industrial France was never supposed to possess. Resonators engineered for frequencies far beyond anything produced by bells. And conduits extending throughout the tower structures, vanishing into walls beneath later construction. But here's the part that always gets hidden. The most sophisticated systems were the ones melted down first. Workers described dismantling whole chambers, removing components, destroying installations that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation: metal shortage, military necessity, revolutionary urgency. But if it was only about bronze reclamation, why were the most complex, most geometrically precise, most acoustically sophisticated systems destroyed first? And why were simple bells often left hanging while elaborate mechanisms were prioritized for destruction? It doesn't make sense, unless those tower systems posed a different kind of danger. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure inside Paris's towers truly displayed acoustic engineering beyond pre-revolutionary capacity, and if some of those systems didn't match any documented bell founding tradition at all, then the entire accepted narrative of European technological development starts to crumble. Imagine what it would mean if Europe's grandest cathedrals were built around something far more ancient. Something functional, something engineered, something we didn't build for worship. Imagine what it means if the towers weren't merely architectural achievements, but the visible components of a continental frequency network that predates recorded history. And perhaps that is why the 1792 discoveries were systematically destroyed, not to supply the revolution, but to eliminate the evidence. The remaining sketches tell their own story, laborers beside systems that look almost technological, geometric arrangements that mirror frequency generation, acoustic chambers too sophisticated for their supposed era. These aren't the kind of findings historians prefer to explain. They're the kind they prefer not to discuss at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the most sophisticated evidence, the most complex acoustic systems, the most geometrically precise infrastructure destroyed so thoroughly? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The resonance chambers were dismantled. The geometric copper arrays were dismantled. The spherical resonators were dismantled. The frequency-aligned conduits were dismantled. The crystal-coated systems were dismantled. And even parts of the technical documentation vanished, almost as if the confiscation had accidentally uncovered a chapter of history that was never meant to surface. A chapter older than the French monarchy, older than recorded Christianity, older than the story we were told. And for one brief moment in 1792, the towers opened just enough to reveal it. But instead of studying it, they destroyed it, melted it, dismantled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Europe's great cathedrals concealed frequency, generation systems, built by a civilization we no longer recognize, then the real question isn't what was discovered in 1792. It's what else remains inside the towers of the world. What other churches, what other structures, what other acoustic systems were quietly destroyed long before anyone thought to document them properly? The 1792 bell confiscation wasn't just a revolutionary metal reclamation effort. It was a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are plenty more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.